Like it or not, we all perpetuate stereotypes about different subregions of the West. We've all pointed to areas that we could never live in because they're 100% flat, or it's always too rainy there, or it's too conservative or too liberal. But we know this woefully oversimplifies, flattens, and cheapens the region's complexity, diversity, and dynamism, don't we? Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. This month, we're speaking with Samuel Western about his new book, The Spirit of 1889, Restoring the Lost Promise of the High Plains and Northern Rockies. In exploring the histories of North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho since their 1889 state constitutional conventions, he reveals how we miss important lessons and actionable items that could actually help those regions today when we impose modern stereotypes backwards onto their history, assuming that their current economic, cultural, or political circumstances have always been what they are today. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this podcast is a one-man operation. I'm the host, producer, sound engineer, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take just about any excuse to read more books and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. Each episode features a conversation with them, historians, journalists, novelists, poets, scientists, sociologists, and others. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity, to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the people who have called it home. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. And if you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends. Follow us on Facebook and X or Twitter, and send in feedback. At the end of this episode, I'll include some more information about my own scholarship and about the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Samuel Western is a prolific journalist and writer of the American West. In addition to teaching various courses on Wyoming history and culture at the University of Wyoming, he was a correspondent for The Economist for over 30 years and also published in the Wall Street Journal, Life, Sports Illustrated, High Country News, and Montana, the magazine of Western history. Western won 2 Wyoming literary fellowships, once for poetry and once for fiction. And he's the author of the 2002 book, Pushed Off the Mountain, Sold Down the River, Wyoming's Search for Its Soul, the 2010 book, A Random Census of Souls, which was a finalist for Best Poetry Book of 2010 by the High Plains Book Awards, the 2015 book, Canyons, which was also published in French in 2017, and most recently, the 2024 University of Kansas Press book, The Spirit of 1889, Restoring the Lost Promise of the Great Plains and Northern Rockies, which we talk about today. In this book, Western explores the states of North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. These states represent a region that Western has been writing about for decades, and one for which he exhibits a passionate concern. They were all territories which had been carved out of the 1861 Dakota Territory and drafted state constitutions in 1889. In studying the political discourse surrounding and written into those 1889 documents, Western noticed a number of core cultural values that might not match with the cultural or political stereotypes many hold about those states today. A Commonwealth sense of community, a libertarianism augmented with support for certain forms of government oversight and regulation, a political pragmatism that looked beyond partisan divides, and various measures that sought to promote forms of egalitarianism and freedom of conscience. Western worries over how the interceding century plus has seen the region abandon these values as identities tied to rural agriculture and resource extraction were challenged by economic roller coasters and have increasingly been pulled into national political scenes. Weaving contemporary advocacy into these historical discussions, Western lays out a number of scenarios where a rekindling of the so-called spirit of 1889 and a rediscovery of those values provide promising ways for the region to chart new courses into the future. Regardless of where we fall on political spectrums, we can all use Western's work to practice creative thinking, searching for solutions unbound by partisan dogmas, and rediscovering loyalties to community and region over the din of national political scenes that rarely take unique local needs seriously. This is thought-provoking work. Samuel Western, welcome to Writing Westward.
Well, thank you. Happy to be here.
Sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful with so many Westerns, your last name and Westward, and I almost called you Samuel Westward there on accident. I'm really pleased to have you on the podcast and excited because we're going to be able to talk about some issues with economics and politics and some things that we haven't done as much of on the podcast. So this should be really great for our listeners. Can we start? Tell us a little bit about your personal relationship with the region, with the West. You weren't born in the West, but you've lived most of your adult life.
I have, yeah. Yeah, I was raised in New England, but I moved to Alaska, and then I went to school in Washington and Oregon, and I tell people I moved east to come to Wyoming. And pretty soon after I moved, I got to Casper in 1982, and I somehow managed to hook up with The Economist magazine, and I started filing pieces for them. And so I wrote for them for almost 25 years as what the British would call a non-staff correspondent, which is really a fancy word for stringer. But I probably wrote like 100 pieces for them, but it gave me a great lens to explore the West, because they just gave me carte blanche, pretty much. And so my area was Western Dakotas, Wyoming, certainly, Montana, Colorado. I did some writing about water issues in Utah. So that was really my introduction to the West, was writing for The Economist.
So you came into it, you had a degree in journalism and I think one in creative writing.
I did. After in 1988, the hottest summer in history, we moved to Charlottesville, Virginia, and I got a degree in creative writing, which was a great adventure.
So as you start writing for The Economist, and you wrote for lots of other outlets as well, what kind of perspective on the West as a region or regional identity, or like what did the place mean to you as you were now tasked with writing about it?
Well, that's a great question. And it took me a while to sort of come to any firm image. The Economist was interested in this junction, the segue between social issues and economic issues. And like the first piece I wrote for them was about economic development on Indian reservations. That's what they're interested in. But for a long time, I started to see, I just saw the West as a commodity producer. And then there were the issues that were associated with being connected to commodities, both economically and cultural. And now I have a little more holistic view of it, but still, I think that the cultural issues are buried very deep in the West, and they surpass the economic issues, though the economic issues are not unimportant.
But the economic issues of a commodity-based, regions which are really relying on commodities, that's a very familiar narrative. The boom-bust cycles of mining and, resource extraction, the really kind of risky economics of agriculture. A bad winter can ruin you. But what it means culturally for a region to be so tied to commodities, I don't hear as much of that. So that's one of the big contributions of what this book does. So it seems like this is something you've been stewing on for a while.
Yeah, I have indeed. And this book started in 2010, and I didn't really start seriously. I didn't write it till 2016. I started it, and it was going to be a 2-year project, but through COVID, et cetera, it took me almost 6 years. So yes, I have been stewing about it for a while.
Well, let's rewind back to 1889, which is really the heart of the book. I mean, this book talks a lot about contemporary issues, but it's always reflecting back on this moment when North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho territories were all writing their state constitutions. And, students of history might know that the territorial process and moving from a territory to state, that's always a really hot topic issue, because adding new states might disrupt the balance of power between parties in Congress. Like
Absolutely.
new states are a big deal. Maybe why we haven't had a new state in so
Yeah.
long, right? Um, can you give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch of what was the national political landscape in 1889 into which these new states were being formed? What was politically what was going on in the
It
nation?
was really a singular era. It was sort of the Gilded Age had plateaued, but it was starting, but it wasn't on the ascendant anymore. But the effects of the Gilded Age and monopoly really were people start to see issues with this. And if you were a state like North Dakota, which is so dependent on commodities, agriculture in particular, and I mean, all these states were dependent on commodities, and they, when the tenor was, we we have to get together. We're poor. We have no money. We're dependent on on commodities. We're dependent on the federal government, but don't be too heavy-handed with us, please. And I like to tell readers that there was this vector, there was this crossing of economic reform and uh, a type of progressivism that was happening. That all these delegates, these constitutional conventions, had to consider these two almost colliding vectors. How are they going to accommodate these two issues? Because they couldn't ignore the outside world. And so I would say that was probably the most striking thing, where there were these two dimensions that all these delegates, and it didn't matter if you were in Idaho or if you were in North Dakota. Those are two very different states, but they still had the same issues to deal with, fundamental systemic issues.
And this is then, of course, the era when the populist movement more broadly starts to emerge from some of these very places on the northern plains, and of course down the southern plains as well, but across the west, of farmers and others who were struggling economically and felt like they were under the thumb of railroads, of banks, of all these larger than them powers that they couldn't control. So one solution was to band together.
Right. Which climaxed in '96 with Bryan, the Cross of Gold speech. But he was a genius at really gathering all the grievance politics of these states. And, a lot of the grievances were true. I mean, it just blew my mind when I was doing research that in 1889, that the Northern Pacific Railroad owned 25% of North Dakota, you know, and they didn't pay any taxes.
Yeah.
So these states, I mean, I think they were totally legitimate at saying, "Hey, we need regulatory reform, but we can't be overly regulatory because we need these guys."
As you state, it's this tension that they're having to try to deal with and trying to write into their constitutions in a way that will help their states not just weather some of these economic troubles, but also to grow their states. They want to attract more residents. They want to have
Oh yeah, I mean,
resilient and
Wyoming
growing economies.
barely got in because we had various representatives up on the floor of the U.S. House flat out lying about our population. It had to be 55,000, I think, the
Yeah,
territorial. And I think we were like 40,000.
yeah,
So a lot of it's just squeaked under the wire.
like more antelope than people.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I know early on, like there was some talk in Wyoming earlier, about one reason to pass women's suffrage was like, well, maybe this will encourage more women and like different new demographic movement into the region, to help grow it. Um, well, let's talk about these state constitutions, which are really at the heart of your book, and what you call Class of '89 values. Um, and I think this will give us some context for why these constitutions, um, from the state that I think today are broadly viewed as conservative strongholds, but their 1889 state constitutions contain what might seem today to be fairly progressive or populist views. Um, what are some of these Class of '89 values that kind of jumped off the page as you were studying the constitutions?
I would say one is they were pragmatic. As I said, they were poor and they needed people. They could not afford to be exclusive. And so they had to write the constitutions that would encourage all sorts of folks. I mean, when I started doing my research, I realized that, we had all sorts of people. We had Hutterites, we had Mennonites, we had LDS Mormons were coming into Western Wyoming, into Southern Idaho. We were permitting very people to have cultures within cultures, and we weren't necessarily excluding them. Though, as you probably know, the Mormons had a hard time of it in Idaho, and you read those constitutional notes, and there was just a major fight in the territorial, in the delegates among, do we let Mormons vote?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mormons didn't get the vote in Idaho until 3 years after the Constitution was passed, so they weren't totally inclusive. But and I think that pragmatism then bleeds into egalitarianism. They really felt, I think, that we're all equal, and I think they believed it politically, and or maybe in their core, but they had limitations too. And I mean, one of the sad parts about this is, what happened to Native Americans during these constitutional conventions. They just got shunned. The people didn't even talk about them because they were citizens, Indians untaxed was the language. If you had left your tribe and were not paying taxes somewhere, you're a citizen. Otherwise, you're second class. So the Native Americans really got hammered in these constitutions, which is a well-known and sad chapter. But I think, again, that pragmatism and egalitarianism.
Are there unique ways in which you saw pragmatism and egalitarian written into these state constitutions that we didn't see in previous state constitutions in
Well,
other
let me
places?
give you an example. It wasn't even before the Constitution Convention that from 1879 to 1882, we had a African American. His name was William Jefferson Hardin, and he served for 4 years in the territorial legislature. Other states didn't do that. I mean, in 1844, Oregon wrote the exclusion law, which forbade any African American from even settling in the state of Oregon. So, and then we had the suffrage movement. And during the Constitutional Convention, I forget when delegate tried to not include suffrage in the Constitution, and he was very roundly rejected by his fellow delegates. Nobody supported this guy. I think originally there probably may have been some truth in the matter. We needed more people, so why not get women in here? But by the time the Constitutional Convention came around in 1889, it was an institution in Wyoming, and that made us pretty unique. And most of the 89ers followed suit to give women the vote. As some of you may know, that early on, all these states, women were given a partial vote when it had to do with schools and school boards. Women could vote who would be on a school board. They could be on a school board. That was their limitation. But we were ahead of the curve when it came to suffrage.
Are there any other values in addition to pragmatism and egalitarianism that you want to mention that were really prominent in these constitutions?
I don't know if I could put a value on this. I think what all 5 states of these did with water was very singular, which is they made water, free-flowing water, the property of the state. Now, that is a statist concept if I've ever seen one. I mean, that's, if communism is defined as those who control the means of economy, well, water is essential. And Wyoming led the way with Elwood Mead, our state engineer, and all the other states. I know they looked at Wyoming's and they all emulated in different ways, but I thought that was singular.
Well, you write about this as kind of, you used actually water at one point as an example of this paradox of a strong core of libertarianism, but with central planning, which seems antithetical. But this blending of, this Western cultural identity of, rugged individuals, but also a focus on community and common welfare. You note that in the John Wesley Powell shows up at
Right.
the North The North Dakota State Convention, I
Actually, he
think.
spoke at North Dakota. He spoke in Wyoming. He spoke in Montana. He did not speak in Idaho. He may have spoken in South Dakota, but there's no record of it. Yeah, and he was an outspoken advocate of this sort of paternalism, as it were. You have to
Yeah.
protect your water from the big guy. So it had a distinct populist tinge to it.
If the state doesn't control the water and regulate it, someone else is going to, and it's not going to be the little guy.
Right.
So they have to accept a master one way or the other. So
Yes.
they opted to say, well, let's have it be the government where we have a representative voice, in theory.
Yes. And when people have asked me, is there any one takeaway from writing this book, and it's pertinent to this conversation, I didn't read any direct quotes, but I read thousands of pages of documents and letters in my research. And the delegates to these constitutions did not subscribe to the idea of absolute liberty, like total pure libertarianism, because they saw what happened in territorial legislatures. It didn't favor the individual, the rugged individual. It favored people with money and clout. So that's why they segued these two values of paternalism and libertarianism. Libertarianism, great, love it. However, we're gonna put some boundaries around that.
Can you help define some of these terms for us? Libertarianism or classical republicanism, and because this is again one of the tensions in the book, and one of the real attention that's at the premise of the book, that when we look at these states today, and then we look at their state constitutions, some of the values that were enshrined there, they seem, things have changed a lot in the last 30 years or so. So how does this kind of classical small r republicanism, libertarianism, blended with some paternalism, how is that different from kind of the social conservatism? So if those are the principles or values that dominated political discourse then in 1889, how is that different from the social conservatism that dominates these states' political discourse today?
Classical liberalism or libertarianism gives short shrift or disdains that the government would have any influence or control over what we do in our social lives. That's pure libertarianism. And pure libertarianism say, if you want to take heroin, fine. It's an extreme form, but a modified form, I think, played a role. And I think it is similar in some ways to classical republicanism, which relied on personal morals and virtues to carry the day, not the government's idea of what you think your virtues should be. And I tried to explore in the book, how did we go from that to right now? There's a lot of issues that have to do with education, with abortion, that would put in the social conservatism camp. And how did we get there? And I'm not sure I can give you a good answer. All I know is that you started seeing in the late 80s and 90s, you started seeing these pieces of legislation showing up in these state legislatures that were never there before. And I don't really know. I think there was a degree of frustration that certain values weren't being adhered to. That's not very eloquent. But we just didn't have the sort of those. I mean, gosh, Brennan, I think the first abortion bill ever was introduced to the Wyoming legislature around 1990. The people just didn't, it was like your business, what you did. And now, of course, it's come out to like gender, trans in school, all these things, which were not on the radar in 1889, but the Republican Party has embraced this value that they need to be, that this is important to their value system, that there's a top-down system that says, thou shalt do this, thou shalt do this, or that.
Well, I think that this region, which historically, especially some of the communities, quote unquote communities that a lot of residents were living in, were very isolated. And but by the 1980s and 90s, with the rise of really politically driven national media that everyone has access to had to have had a big impact on drawing this region into these national fights of, social identity
Brent, I
markers and
could
kind
not
of
agree
culture
more.
war issues.
No, it absolutely, and I think a dynamic that may have happened is that for the longest time, this region never had any money. I mean, we were considered, we weren't Mississippi poor or Arkansas poor, but we a lot of subsistence living, but we didn't think we were poor. I mean, we were all fed, we managed to build our schools, you know, but then, and there were the big three networks, there was church, there was the weekly newspaper. And then all of a sudden this, this flood of outside media came in comparing other people's lives and what you have and what you don't have and what they have. I think it fed a very human fear, of scarcity. I think it played a direct role in how we morphed into a different type of republicanism or a different value set.
Well, just like, I mean, that every region morphed in various ways, with those dynamics. Well, you write about in, I think it's 2008, you had a little folder on your desktop, on your computer screen called the Rocky Mountain Pluralism Project, which is kind of where this book has its origins. Because I think on its face, some people might pick this book up and assume it is just a response to, um, the election of Trump in 2016, or like that political movement. But you had this, you were already putting stuff away. I mean, that obviously maybe makes things resonate in a specific way today, but tell us about this project and how you had envisioned it in 2008, when you started kind of collecting
Yeah,
things.
it started, the book I wanted to write was called American Tribalism. I said, we're just dividing into these tribes. In the book, like The Big Sort hadn't even come out yet. Have you read this book, The Big Sort? It's about how America is just breaking into different subdivisions along political lines. Bill Bishop was the writer, and he had a really good demographer working with him. But that book hadn't come out yet. But I could see that America was getting more and more tribal. And so I wrote a book proposal and I pitched it to a number of academic presses, and boy, did I get blown out of the water. People said, that's your imagination. This isn't happening to this country. Okay. A woman from Harvard just belittled me. Here was a guy with an MFA in creative writing who wanted to write a book about tribalism. Who are you? So I said, okay, Sam, why don't we put a more of a regional context? What's happening here? And again, I started seeing this sort of disappearance of this live and let live attitude. And then also this tension that was coming into this area especially in places like Montana and northern Idaho. Montana, I mean, it happened actually probably in the late 70s and early 80s. People threw the AUM animal unit book per acre book out the window and bought ranches on scenic value. And the people that bought those ranches were not of the same ilk as the generation that bought them before. They had outside money. They oftentimes closed their ranches. I was like, well, where's this all leading to? We have this, is this going to be like the uber wealthy and the surf economy? I hope not. And then I also could see these threads of what we call movement conservatism coming into the area. I said, what is this is all about? We traditionally do not vote in these type of leaders or put them in any type of leadership position. And I think the last soldier that represents those values is John Tester of Montana, who just got voted out. Tester was a charming man in his own way. He's 50 pounds overweight. He's missing 3 of his fingers. Could be very use very graphic language in talking to the voter, and people loved him for it. And
He
he
was a
was very
man of the
much like,
people.
yeah. He said, no, I'm just not going to get the abortion. It's just not my business. But you could start to see this swelling. And I said, what is going on? Why are we splitting into this way? I wanted to ask the question, are we indeed splitting? And what's causing this? So then that started morphing into this book. And then I sort of got deeper and deeper. I found like, well, what am I going to do here? Am I going to cut or fish or cut bait? And finally, in 2007 or 18, Montana, the magazine of Western history, published an article. And I said, okay, I'm going to use that as my sort of my foothold and sell the idea from there. But it started again that I wanted to see we're moving in this tribal, moving into this polarized place, and in a region that traditionally wasn't always polarized. Of course, we did have some terrible, the mining fights with the mines in Idaho and Montana. Union versus Anaconda talk about polarized community, man. But it wasn't always that way.
You're starting to identify changes in the region over the last 130 years, starting and seeing problems. Maybe one of the first, as you're saying here, is that you were starting to notice these people are more divided, more tribal and less communal. And so throughout your book, you identify a number of the big changes, the problems that it's led to, and then you kind of chew on some solutions or some potential models for going back to these 1889 values and how they could be applied today. So I thought maybe we walk through a few of these.
Sure.
A few of these kind of changes that you'd
Yeah.
noticed. And maybe the first, which we've already briefly touched on, this idea of the 89ers crafting very active state governments
Yes.
who had a lot of power.
Right.
And then over the 130 years, that's shifting to a broad distrust of government and not looking to government as an entity that can solve problems or fight for you, but as one that is your adversary. What are some of the events? And you talk about a lot of them. What are a couple of the key events that start to mark this shift or drive this shift towards kind of mistrusting or being skeptical of government's utility?
There has always been, as you know, a mistrust between these states and the federal government, and it's sort of waxed and waned. And when I was teaching Wyoming economic history in Laramie, I sort of came up with this thesis that I think we had a peaceful era from the end of World War II till about 1975 or so, which there was relative harmony. And relative is the operative word. But then a couple things happened. One, there was this huge energy boom. And these states, on average, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming are on average 50% federally owned. Idaho is almost 65% federally owned. South Dakota and North Dakota only are like 2 to 3% federally owned. But there are millions of acres of federal minerals under these two states. So suddenly, there were all these riches to be mined from the federal mineral estate. And this created a huge tension because the federal government was kind of like, whoa, okay, all right, now, we have a process for doing this. And you could just tell this tension built over extracting these and coal. Most of the coal in the West, in Montana, Wyoming, I think 90% is from the federal mineral estate. So the federal government became the enemy. They're the person we always had to work on, that to chip away at their power. Secondly, was we had this disastrous 15 years of agriculture due primarily to high interest rates and agricultural policy having to do with exports. And Brennan, when I was interviewing ranchers in this book, I had at least half a dozen times ranchers say, we still haven't recovered from the 80s. And I think maybe they've recovered financially, but the trust, any sort of trust in the U.S. government had evaporated. So the U.S. government, even though we're dependent upon them, is no longer a reliable player in our field. So you had these two things. You had commodity extraction, you had agriculture, both dependent on the federal government, which was increasingly seen as the enemy. And I think that was the start of this new chapter, an anti-government feeling. And of course, in Utah and Nevada, Clive and Bundy, all these, this was the same era, the Sagebrush Rebellion. And it took a
Yeah.
little different hue in these states, but it was the same tone and tenor, I think. But I think those two things really established a either further distrust of the federal government and opened up this lacuna, this space for movement conservatism to move in.
To try to provide answers or to try to give people
Yes.
something to hold on to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
But of course, I mean, these are stuff. This is all stuff in the last 50 years. You go back another 50, I mean, the 50 years prior to that, and there's a strong foundation for people to build on in terms of mistrusting the government. I mean, in the early settlement of these areas, through government land offices, mining law, how Indian affairs were administered by the federal government, like ripe with corruption.
Oh,
And
absolutely. From the get-go.
and
Yeah.
yes, and so lots of very valid reasons to be upset with the federal government and how it was administering things in the area.
I do think it waxed and waned,
Yeah,
and after World War II, there was a lot of money flooding from the federal government after World War II. And it sort of was it was like the grease that made things better, really strong exports. The oil patch went up and down, but, I think there was the relative peace, but also I did not mention that the rise of environmentalism. At first people just didn't pay attention to it. And then suddenly people realized that, wow, we are going to be excluded from extracting certain things or cutting down trees or logging. And there was a backlash. That was also part of the movement and the fact, I think people saw environmental groups and the federal government in bed together.
and all as outside entities that are meddling in local affairs, right? And often, as we say, there are very valid criticisms, but also they do take on the shape of being a scapegoat for all problems, which sometimes is perhaps unfair. You also write about what you call, I think use the word cult, so the cult of commodity prosperity, which 1889, these are regions whose economies are largely dependent on agriculture, mining, timber, ranching.
Right.
This is all natural resource extraction, or I guess that's a little different with ranching, although I guess you're
No,
extracting
I'd put ranching.
nutrients from the, yeah, I mean,
Right,
it's
right,
all tied to the
right,
land, um, and it's all tied to then commodity markets and selling these
right,
raw materials on a
right.
commodities market, which is volatile. Talk to us about how this cult of, you say, commodity prosperity really became the bedrock foundation for a lot of these states. And so what? Like, what's the problem? What are the negative symptoms that have come out of that over the last 130 years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, the problem well, I think people just there's an institutional memory of this is how it used to be. And, there were some, from, the golden age of agriculture, relatively 1897 to 1919 were great years for agriculture. And oil was really getting underway. And I think that sort of built a foundation of this idyllic, this halcyon days. And of course, in 1919 and 1921 was the most deflationary year in U.S. economic history. And it just collapsed. I mean, you don't have to read very much. But people still regarded that. They sort of like had this selective amnesia. They forgot about how bad the Great Depression was. And then when World War II came along, of course, there was this huge, starting in 1938, there's this huge demand for raw material of all sorts. And we were like the breadbasket. I mean, I use that metaphorically, oil, gas, iron ore, timber, wheat, grains of all sorts. People wanted us for commodities. They didn't want us for our cultural centers and our cities and our intellectual powerhouse. They wanted us. We were sort of like a colonial colony, and people were doing pretty well, you know. And I think those two epochs from 1897 to 1919, and then from 1938 to about 1965, uh, people that lodged in people's minds, and they never forgot that those eras. And even though it was just agriculture starting in the late 60s and 70s, went on this calamitous downhill uh, stretch, even before interest rates started being a problem. There were just way too many farmers. I mean, that's what the U.S. government thought. That's what the USDA thought. And, but people still hung on to that, regardless of what the data or their income said. This is the life we had once had. We want it back, no matter what we have to do.
And of course, as they're becoming increasingly aware of circumstances elsewhere in the country, during these same World War II boom years, places like Los Angeles or the Pacific Northwest, they also boomed economically during the
Yes,
war,
right.
with shipbuilding and industry. But those were types of economic development which transitioned much smoother into the post-war era,
Absolutely.
where these states you're talking about, if they're tied to commodity prices and those prices drop, and meanwhile they haven't built up cities, they haven't built up as much of a diversified economy like some of those other places did, and they now realize like, oh, what happened, right? And
Yeah,
the other places are doing great, and we're
yeah.
not.
And Brendan, I think people down deep, the metric that you could not ignore was that it was out migration.
Yeah.
People were just moving out of the Dakotas. Wyoming lost population, and you can't ignore that. Suddenly, what happens to your town? You don't have enough students to have a school. First, your high school closes, then your middle
Yeah.
school. And when your elementary school closes, that's all she wrote. You have a post office and a community store. So people deep down inside, they knew what was going on. I just think it was almost like this cognitive dissonance. They just didn't want to see that era pass and become history.
Yeah. I mean, that's why maybe you call it a cult of commodity prosperity, because it's not necessarily logical. It's this holding on to this past identity, this uh, nos- not quite nostalgia, but that they remember things in a certain way, and it had become so ingrained in their cultural and regional identity. Is like, this is who we are.
Right.
But
Yeah.
if
And,
that's no longer a positive or a feasible economic path forward, that's the crisis.
right. And, a friend of mine in Jackson, name is Jonathan Schechter, and he's an economist and demographer. And he uses something I call Schechter's maxim, which is that economics moves faster than perception. Perception moves faster than politics. So, I mean, I am not an economic historian. I'm a student of economic history. I've written a lot about economic history, but I'm not trained as one. But I did that to the economic lens because I think that moves faster than everything else. That's where the future is going.
So that's where we need to look for answers as well, right? Try to prognosticate a bit or see what's.
Right. But
Yeah.
but but at the same time, I've been asked, did you change your mind about anything as you wrote this book? Yes. When I started out, I used the 80-20 ratio. I thought that 80% of this change that was happening in the Great Plains and Northern Rockies was economic. It was 20% cultural. It flipped. I think 80% of the changes are cultural. Only 20% are economic. Culture just has this. I mean, Herodotus said, "Culture is king." It's so true. We just want this culture, and which includes who gets social recognition. Well, if we the Democrats, and I'm not trying to be D or R here, but that's one of the things that I think this region has to, our value system, who gets social recognition here. Uh, so I think that culture is probably the main driver of change.
One part of this cultural change you write about is, and this is entangled again with this cult of commodity prosperity and so forth, was you write about rural exceptionalism kind of becoming just hard baked into people's souls. That rural is what matters and a real disdain for the urban, um, and a real demonization of cities. And this happens all over the country.
Yeah, it does. And it's
But
old too. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
this isn't anything new.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to, you also already mentioned, kind of the East versus West, insider versus outsider. I mean, these tensions are all over the place in the West. As you did this work, how did you see this play out over the 130 years from 1889? Like this cultural uh, clinging to rural exceptionalism at the cost of growing and building cities, which that could be the foundation for more diversified economies. So here's an economic problem, but you tied it to a cultural cause.
I did. And so what are you asking? What's the question you're
Well,
asking?
talk to us about like this idea of rural exceptionalism and
Okay. All
how is
right.
that tied with
Yeah.
the growth or not growth of cities, and how has that become a problem now for the region?
Yeah. I just think historically, and it doesn't matter, it could be Alabama, it could be, Arizona, is that there's always been the sustain for urban areas. They have the power, they have the universities, they have the assessed valuation. I mean, Brendan, the assessed valuation of Ada County, which is Boise and Meridian, is 3 times for commercial and residential, is 3 times more than the total assessed valuation of the state of Wyoming. So what do we do with assessed valuation? We build schools. So they've got the schools, they got the money. There's a lot of grievance politics to go back and forth. What I was really sick about writing about these dying, these towns that are just going to go with the tumbleweed. And that is why I went and looked at Petroleum County, Montana, which is when a group of people said, if we don't do something, we're going to lose our school. Here's what we have to do. And what we have to do is we have to toss out that image that we are somehow an exceptional race and that urban dwellers are evil. We have to really just toss that out the window and say, where are our values? What do we want to do? How are we going to blend our rural values into an urban? Petroleum County has 480 people. So Winnett, I don't know, people at Winnett has like, I don't know, maybe 300 people. But
That's the big city.
they do a series of meetings and deliberations. And some people who really wanted to break the mold, did not want to be stereotyped as D or R or liberal or conservative. They said, we want to keep our schools. How do we want to keep our schools? What can we do, like small steps? For example, first thing they did was they got a bunch of ranchers to supply the local school with free beef. So there was a direct connection in there. And then they got together a group called Winnett Aces, which was what they wanted to do was buy land, in which enough land that young ranchers could join together and lease their cattle out, like the commons. Mon Dieu, how communista, huh? How it was, but they said, if we want to survive, we have to do things differently. And that's what I tried to concentrate in the book. I didn't want to write the same old stuff over again. And I can't tell you how impressed I am by people like in Winnett, or there's Montana is really leading the way in sort of, I want to say a rural renaissance. That's a little too dramatic. But you're starting to see, look at the demographic shifts. You're starting to see there are 56 counties in Montana, and I think all but 10 are gaining in population. That's a very different narrative than North Dakota, because people want to move there. They can work out of your home now. I mean, this is sort of an aside, but when I went to Oregon and went to Ottawa County, I was driving around Enterprise, and this guy said, "See that house over there?" He said, 2 years ago, that house was for sale for $190,000. It just sold for $450,000. But people are moving. They're moving to these areas. They're bringing different values. But I think I got to be careful here. I think they know they don't want to bring urban values to a rural area and enforce them on the population. I think they said, well, if we got a good school system, we can send our kids there. So again, I think it's these places like Winnett, and places like Wallowa County, Oregon, I think are leading the way. They're just breaking the mold.
And this is really at the core of like, these 1889 values,
Right.
you think, right? This kind of creative thinking, collaborative thinking, willingness to, yeah, to break molds and to find hard solutions, regardless of where they fall,
Yeah.
like on a political
And
spectrum,
one of them
perhaps.
is we have to accept that we're going to have to work with the federal government. We not like it, but how much energy are we going to put into uh, casting aspersions in the federal government and holding, you know, these demonstrations about mine and mill closures? How much? It doesn't put any sod on the dike, as they say in Holland. How
Sure.
can we do differently? And I don't know. I wrote about a sawmill. It's not a saw. It's a mill in Wallowa, Oregon, that doesn't cut any timber.
Wallowa County, Oregon, which is a very rural,
Whoa,
very
really
isolated.
rural. Yeah.
There's just there's not a lot of people out there, but you write about some fascinating, surprising dynamic things going on there. So, like, you were starting to get so, yeah, tell us this timber example. There's also example of salmon with
Right.
agricultural
Right.
co-ops.
But again, if we're on the subject of how these rural communities, this urban evil, rural virtuous, how people get away from that mold. And so I went to Wallowa. I'd read about Wallowa in a number of different places just in my research, and so I went there. And one of the guys I met this guy who ran a mill, and it it was a sawmill that milled no dimension lumber. What they did was create, all those bundles of firewood you see in Safeway. They made those, and then they made post and pole for making arches and trellises over orchards. And then they took everything else and made pulp out of it, and then they made wood shavings for insulation. And so when I was talking to this guy, the guy who ran it, I could tell this guy, his mind wouldn't stop. I mean, he just like, where's the next solution? So I said, tell me about your relationship to the U.S. Forest Service. And this is a county which had had a really miserable, very uh, acid tinged relationship with the Forest Service because they thought they were responsible for closing down the mills. And in part they were. And he said, oh, it's great. Okay, tell me about it. I asked him, I said, so would you be free to tell me like how much you pay for an average timber sale? He said about $8,000. And I thought I misheard. I said, what? He said, yeah, look, this is restoration forestry. And they want people to come in there and take these burnt or these smaller trees, and they want to restore this land. So the biggest thing we have to pay are road costs, but we don't pay anything for the timber. But Brennan, instead of, getting into grievance politics about the policies of the federal government, this mill leaned into them and said, we can create this mill, which employs 25 people. You don't have to have a degree in MIT to work for this guy. And so, I asked him, I said, I got really curious. I said, what are the values around this mill? And he said, be kind. It's the first thing he said. He said, number two is everybody shovels, you know? And I was like, wow, think about that versus the old mill, policy, which is, if you don't do the job, out you go. You've got a sick kid. Sorry, somebody else going to take your place. They had a whole different solution. And yet they were gung ho, man. They want to make money. And they were very community based. And I thought that is a different, I don't want to use paradigm, but it's just a different model for how to create commodities and have it be in- included in the community.
Hmm. It still is commodity production,
It still is commodity production. Yeah,
um,
absolutely. Yeah.
but done in create new and creative ways.
Yeah. Yeah. If you stood outside that mill, you wouldn't think it would be very much different than any other mill because you can hear saws going, but what they're doing is they're chopping these logs into firewood. They're not cutting it in dimensional lumbers, and there's pulp trucks coming and going. and there's trucks bringing logs in, and but when you go in, you say, this is different.
In the latter chapters of the book, even as you're wading through some real dark, troubling stuff where it seems like there's no hope in sight, you bring in these examples, um, which are quite hopeful, um, and but my question is, and I think this would be a lot of people who live in these regions or
Mhm.
people elsewhere. Like, that sounds like a great thing they have going for those 25 employees,
Right.
but for, the region's other residents, how are these kinds of ideas scalable? I mean, if this region is how do you affect regional change at deep and meaningful levels on a broad scale,
Oh,
in practical ways?
yeah.
I mean, and I know that there is no easy answer to this, which is maybe part of the reason why you're so focused on these values, because there's no easy path, but at these values in these 1889 constitutions, you see that might give us the power to walk down these hard paths.
Right.
Is that a
That
a,
is, and you're asking a great
a
question.
fair conclusion?
Yeah, it is. And let me just cite you an example, which has to do with agriculture, which I think is at the core in some way, because all these states have agricultural values, very, very deep agricultural values. And the rancher, I interviewed a rancher, Bill Milton, up in Montana, and how he changed his narrative by running 300 to 500 cows, which is he became a member of a co-op. He did things differently. You had to collaborate. You had to work with other ranchers. Yet there were standards that, you can't say, nobody could tell me how to feed my cows. Well, this Oregon Natural Beef said, you can't put anything off the ranch into your cow. You can't put anything that's non-animal. I mean, you can't, non-natural. You can't put like those cattle feeds that have like chickens, parts of chickens stuff in them, protein. So you can't do that. And just through that choice to join a co-op, and it's a lot of work. There's a lot of collaboration. You have to sort of relinquish a part of your individual. It makes a huge difference. Number two, I interviewed a guy named Gabe Brown pretty extensively. Went up to his ranch, heard him speak. And Gabe Brown's kind of a force of nature. Everybody can't be Gabe Brown, but Gabe Brown doesn't sell anything to a slaughterhouse. I mean, to a big packer. He has it packed, and he has killed and packed, and he sends it out through mail orders to people on frozen packets. Now, again, he's an exception. He's got more energy. He's 70. He's got more energy than anybody I know. But that model, which is, to pledge yourself to a packing house and take the price that they want, has got to be one of the oldest grievances of the Western stock. So somehow you got to change that. You got to get out. And I think it's just, it's iteration by iteration. Ranchers tend to be conservative, but again, it's first adapters I read about in the book. First
Yeah.
adapters that are people that are making the difference. So, but I mean, Brendan, the alternative is that we just hunker down and wait for the next boom, and then stick enough money away to survive the next bust. That's the classic pattern, and that pattern has to change.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pattern that's led to, as you say, this demographic collapse of the region, out-migration. There is a new in-migration, you say, in Montana, which is positive. A devil's bargain, though. Rural gentrification comes
Right.
causes lots of problems.
Yeah.
But this is that pragmatism really at play then.
Right. Yeah. I still think pragmatism is at the heart
Yeah.
of of this conversation.
Well,
Yeah.
hopefully that kind of pragmatism is contagious and people see the results, and they're moved to make some changes and to think creatively, by proactively choosing to do so rather than reactively having to, right, like whenever the next bust is and having to just always one step behind.
Yeah.
This might help the read. These are
Yeah.
ideas that could help. These values could help the region get
Yeah. And
step
I
ahead.
think we might be able to put that under the rubric, under the header of for agriculture, of regenerative agriculture, which is a huge
Yeah.
topic. and it defies definition. But it's
Yeah.
a different model than what was used, say, for most of our agricultural history in this country.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about like environmental stewardship ideas and stewardship agriculture, but these are all forward-looking, future-looking models for agriculture and resource extraction, not just getting as much out today as possible, but how do we make this sustainable? About sustainability, right? Which is to everyone's benefit. Well, I like this. It gives me hope. Again, no easy roads ahead, but I mean, this is these are regions that have weathered some hard times and proven resilient in shocking ways. So hopefully they can, these states and the residents can continue to move things forward. Well, as we wrap up, do you want to take a moment to tell us about what else you're working on? I think there's a blog that's related to this project that we should be
Yes.
looking out for.
Yeah, I'm hope that I can launch this in about a month. It's called, I was approached by someone that said, you need to write the 1889 blog. And my first response is, oh, no, not another blog, you know. But then the idea didn't go away. So I set myself a task. I said, okay, give yourself an hour at your keyboard, and you can write 10 topics in an hour that you think might be pertinent to this blog. Maybe you should reconsider. Well, I wrote 22 in half an hour. So I was like, no. So I've been talking to, I have a person that helps with these kind of things. So I think I am going to go ahead with it. It'll be bi-monthly, under 1,000 words. I'll probably do it through Substack. I think my writer friend says Substack is probably the best medium for this. But it's, in a way, I do, the person who was trying to convince me to do this and said, Sam, there's only a handful of people right now that have your knowledge of these states and how they worked together in their origins, and an analysis or just observations on what the future brings. I mean, for example, it never fails to amaze me that farmers vote for a president that goes against their economic interest. I don't want to talk about Republican or Democrat. I want to talk about, can you tell me what's going on here? I mean, Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan, but John Auction Block at the head of USDA. Oh, man. I mean, he turned, he was totally, and David Stockman, who just said that U.S. agriculture operates on a concept of larceny. Why would you vote for a president that's going to put those type of people as opposed to Jimmy Carter? Anyway, that's a values. No, I don't think it's ERR. And so it'll be stuff like that.
That's great. So it'll expand on the book and play some of these things out. I think it sounds great. I'll keep my eye out for it when the Substack goes live.
All right. Okay.
Well, congrats on getting this book out. Thanks so much for spending a few minutes with us today. This has been really great.
Well, Brendan, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Take care, Samuel.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on X or Twitter at Writing West. There you can get updates and leave comments and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic and public research and promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with award, grant, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's REDD Center. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As you know by now, my name is Brendan Rensing, and since I serve as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else for the podcast, you can direct praise or critique my work. As a historian, I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, native peoples, genocide studies, religion, the environment, and other topics. My most prominent publications include a 2018 book, Native but Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America, a 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled Histories of the North American West. So send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Red Center, I'm also general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website that curates student-researched and written micro-histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about that project, the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink, that's bwrensink.org. Email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well.